started. We've got a really good turnout for this. So I'll go ahead and just get the ball rolling. So I'm Zach Hyder. I'll be moderating the panel today. Thank you all for logging in and being part of this discussion. As you know from just the overall mood, everything nowadays is all about the COVID crisis that we're in. The team at Hubble Communications has just been, really interested in sort of looking at how this is impacting the political landscape. And so we pulled together this webinar in large part because we wanted to share some observations with you. And because we work with a lot of stakeholders and partners out there in the field, we pulled in a couple organizations that we thought should be part of that discussion. I'm going to do a little bit of just table setting. I said for folks that maybe didn't hear it, we've gone ahead and proactively muted everybody's mics. Just keeps the noise level down. If you get antsy and try to unmute your mic, just do us a favor and keep yourself on mute. There will be a question and answer portion of this. When we get to that, we're going to ask folks to use the chat function. It allows us to sort of referee questions that are coming in and direct them to the right folks. I'm sure by now everybody's getting used to doing these virtual meetings, and we're going to do our best to pull this one off without any tech glitches. So there will also be a recording of this that is sent out to everybody that's here. So if you have a colleague or an associate who for some reason could not participate and you want to share it with them, we should be getting that out to everybody early next week. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start by introducing you to our three panelists. Chris Edmonds, probably not a stranger to a lot of you. He's a principal at Hubble Communications and a veteran of a number of political campaigns, both in Oregon and the West and the East Coast. John Horvick and the team at DHM Research also need no introduction. John will be talking a lot today about some of the recent polling that his firm has done, specifically on the COVID issue in the state of Oregon. And last but certainly not least, John Isaacs. He's the VP of Government Affairs of the Portland Business Alliance. He's held a number of positions, public policy and government affairs positions, and is also a veteran of a number of winning political campaigns throughout his career. Emphasis on the winning. So thank you guys for joining us and being part of this discussion. We're going to just go ahead and jump right into a big question that I know, John Horvick, you and your team at DHM have been watching very closely, which is just how Oregonians overall are feeling about this crisis that we're in. These are very unusual times. I think the term everybody is using these days is uncertain times. But we'd love to just hear a little bit from you about the work that you guys have done and continue to do in terms of what you are seeing out there.
Right. Thanks so much, Zach, and I appreciate the opportunity to share these results with folks and to talk about how it's impacting politics in Oregon. So DHM's, we're going to talk a little bit about an Oregon survey we just completed. We also finished one up in Washington recently, and I just, in the last few minutes, put another Oregon survey into the field. One thing that we're keeping track of is these are really unusual times, and so we want to get a sense of where people are emotionally. And we asked people in our recent Oregon survey, we gave them a standardized scale of anxiety. And people answered a bunch of questions, and then they get scored. And you can see 12% of Oregonians right now say that score is having severe anxiety, another 19% having moderate levels. Now, most people have mild or minimal, but we're talking about a third of Oregonians who are feeling quite stressed, and that's independent necessarily of COVID. But it's a big group of people, and something we're going to be tracking over time. Just real quickly, anxiety levels are much higher among young people, and that's a real theme that we see in our data with COVID, that there is this gap between how young people are experiencing and those who are older, and it's especially true on this. Another thing we've been just wondering about is, do people feel like their feelings and their reactions are similar to others or dissimilar? And so we asked Oregonians if they feel that they're more concerned, less concerned, or have the same level of concern as others. And you sort of look at this, it's sort of split between more or less and then a majority at the same. But here we see some important partisan differences. And Zach, if you go to the next slide, Democrats are twice as likely as Republicans to say that they're more concerned. I think that my sense is that as COVID has evolved, that there's been at first there was a little bit of a closing of the gap between Republicans and Democrats as we went to stay-at-home orders and states responded. My sense, without good data right now, but my sense is that maybe that gap is widening again. But here we saw Democrats twice as likely to say that they're more concerned. But again, look at that age breakdown. And that's something that's, I think, really important. Younger people are 3 times as likely as older folks to say that they're concerned. Guys, it's rooted in economics. The financial concern that younger people are feeling in these early days is much more severe than what older people are feeling. And I think that a big part of the reason that we see that breakdown is because of economics. So do people think things are going to get better, worse, or stay about the same? And I think that these results are a bit of a Rorschach test for people. So we asked, do things going to get better in a month, 6 months, a year from now? And you can see how that they're going up here. So a month from now, about 40%-ish think that things are going to get better, but that means the majority think that maybe they're getting worse or they're unsure. Here's where I think that there's different interpretations. You look at 6 months out and a year out. Now you have clear majorities saying that things are going to get better. But I've talked to some economist friends of mine. Look at the 6 months out. Just 29% think that things will be much better in 6 months. 44% think that they'll get somewhat better. But my economist friends tell me, gosh, if only 29% think things are going to be much better, watch their spending. Are they going to be purchasing major appliances, plane tickets, events for entertainment, things that you typically purchase, far out? Because if they're not, then that says a lot about what expectations are and how the economy might change. And so even though lots of folks think that they're going to get better, still a fair number of people are soft on that even 6 months out.
Well, John, thanks for the table setting with that. I think it just helps kind of give everybody a feel of where things are. And I think it's worth mentioning that John and the team at DHM are going to be continuing to do polls. John, you guys have one in the field now, correct?
In the last 30 minutes.
Okay, so there'll be additional data points, and I think it's no surprise. Everybody knows that a week these days kind of feels like a year in terms of how things are changing. So I want to just kind of present this bigger question in terms of how Oregonians are feeling about how we are actually handling this crisis. And as we go through the rest of this panel, I'm going to use some of the data from DHM's broader survey. And John, maybe you want to speak to, just as a starting point, a little bit about what these numbers in terms of how we're handling the management of COVID in Oregon, in terms of what these numbers say and how they may differ from times when we're not in crisis.
Yeah, so this is a simple scale, asking people on these different people and organizations, asking Oregonians about these people, different organizations, if they approve or disapprove of how they're managing COVID. I'll just draw your attention real quickly because it says a lot about the state of politics in Oregon right now. Look at Kate Brown's numbers, and the strongly approve, somewhat approve, you get to 54% management of COVID. In our DHM polling in late 2019, we hit our overall approval rate at about 40%. So that's this is specific to COVID, but a pretty big jump. And what we've seen nationally, and I think Chris and John will speak to this more, is that states where governors have taken swift and clear action, voters have been more supportive. States where they haven't, we've seen a voter support decline. Where I have positive feelings in these data is that there's broad support for our public health officials, from Center for Disease Control, Oregon Health Authority on down, and that does give me some encouragement how we can move forward together.
Yeah. So when we were having our conversation about this panel, those of you that are on know that we titled it "How COVID-19 is Influencing Oregon's Elections." And John Isaacs was very right in saying we should be asking, is it influencing Oregon's elections? One way that we obviously know it is having some influence, this goes back to John's data, is, in terms of support for funding measures that are already on the ballot, the shifts that we're seeing there. John Isaacs, I want to just, get your thoughts to some of the points I know you've made in terms of how else this may or may not be influencing both the May primary, but also the November election.
John, you're on mute.
I can tell he's looking for the button.
There we go. Sorry, it kept giving me a weird message. Well, the one thing I'll say, just disclaimer before I answer any of these questions is, anyone who's speculating how this current crisis is going to impact both the primary and the general election is doing just that, speculating. Those of us who worked on campaigns, we really look to polling like that done by DHM to try to guide our thinking about it. But I'll just share a few thoughts. First of all, I think we can't overstate how much this entire election this year, whether it's the primary or the general, the fundamentals of it are not going to change that much because the entire election is going to be about the president. And that is because our president, whether you agree with his policies or not, makes everything about him all the time. I mean, you can see that every day in the COVID-19 briefings that he's doing. It's just part of how he leads the country, that he is the center of all attention. And so this election in every way is going to be about him. And that's going to impact races up and down the ballot, and that's not going to change. Now, the way people judge his response and the federal government's response to this crisis and the economic damage that's done by the steps that have been taken to sort of mitigate the public health crisis is up in the air, but it will be about Trump. And so for the primary, the election that's coming up here in a month, there's a couple of things I would point to that give us some clues. First of all, if there's been any shift in polling, it's been, as we saw in DHM's poll here in Oregon, I think you saw this in Washington as well, is that ratings have gone up for local leaders. Typically, the president gets those types of bounces in national crises, right? And we saw a little bit of a bump for the president when this first started, but this week, Gallup put out their latest tracking poll, and his approval ratings are down to 43%. They said it was the biggest single week drop of his presidency. But then we've seen governors across the country, both Democrat and Republican, have their approval ratings go up by in some cases, even more than we've seen Governor Brown's ratings go up. And then I'd also point out in the slide we just saw, local governments are receiving very high ratings. So in terms of our local elections, that's a number that bodes very well for, Mayor Wheeler, who's in a competitive re-election campaign right now. So I think, the public is going to be looking to leaders who have taken strong action, have been stable and confident in a crisis. And then as far as how ballot measures go, I don't know. I think it's really hard to tell. I still think those are values-based elections. And it's a question of, does a campaign do a good job of communicating its values to voters? And so I don't know how much this question about whether should funding measures stay on the ballot or not are going to impact how voters actually vote. I would also point out, I mentioned Wisconsin, I think Democrats in this primary are going to be, it's going to be still a Democrat-driven primary because of the Democratic nomination process. And I think they're going to be energized to vote in any case. And so that, of course, when you're looking at polling on any given measure, it's going to, the first thing I would look at is the split between Democrats and Republicans, knowing that especially regionally, this is going to be a big Democrat turnout primary.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things everybody is watching is just the overall economic impact. So, there's two tracks to this, right? There's the public health impacts, and I suspect that, John, going back to your data, where we're seeing some of the bumps in approval is how we're handling the public health pandemic. Right. Fairly quickly there, we would expect the economic portion of this crisis to become much more of a focus, right? So as we flatten the curve, what we're going to start to have more conversations around, and I think we're already seeing it just tracking local and national news headlines, is this issue of economic insecurity. So Chris, a question for you, how might economic insecurity issues be influencing the political climate, and specifically, how might they influence it in Oregon?
Sure. Well, Zach, I don't know if you're able to go back to John's slide where people are sort of making predictions for when they think that this crisis is going to start letting up. This one right here, right? So if you look at these numbers, what it tells me is that the electorate at large is viewing this current moment as a short-term crisis, and that their optimism around the mid and long term is much more improved. That doesn't surprise me at all because it also aligns with the other numbers that we see in this survey around who people are trusting for information and movement in the approval rating of the president versus local governments and governors. What we're seeing is that leaders who are sort of on the front lines of providing real-time, accurate information to the public in a non-political, non-partisan way are seeing their approval, right? It tells me that voters right now see a short-term crisis. They're not necessarily as concerned with the long-term political issues that were top of mind 2 or 3 months ago. And politicians, at least right now, are being rewarded for avoiding partisan politics. I don't think that that's necessarily a good thing when you talk about the fundamentals of the election that John Isaacs was talking about around Trump's approval ratings, and that this election is going to be a referendum on the president. Because obviously, he's made a calculation. Look at his press conferences or his Twitter feed. He's made the calculation that he actually needs to politicize this issue, and that politicizing coronavirus will actually be a net political gain for him in the long term. Now, in the short term, it's not working well for him, but there's obviously an attempt to politicize this. The big question to the question that you asked, Zach, is at what point do Americans start to personally feel the economic pain? Right. At least to date, the vast majority of folks who were laid off during the month of March still received some income at the end of March. Those who were on the front end may have had their unemployment claims processed. At this point, we've seen nationally and here in Oregon, the unemployment system is overwhelmed. Yesterday, the Paycheck Protection Program ran out of money. I saw some statistics and a nationwide map this morning around the distribution of those funds, and it was really interesting that the disproportionate share of those funds on a per capita basis went to battleground states. They're all through the heartland. In some cases, you have states in the Midwest that receive twice as much per capita as Oregon and California did from that Paycheck Protection Program. So I think you're going to see a lot of folks politicizing that. That's probably going to be something that becomes a feature of the next few weeks. The question for me is the sort of federal and state stimulus response going to end up on the kitchen tables of the average voter in a timely fashion? If it does, you're likely to see a more muted response to the economic concerns, at least in the political and campaign environment. If that money doesn't get there, if we continue to see problems in getting funding out, if Congress fails to pass additional relief programs, I think that the voter acrimony just continue to climb, and that'll be pretty disastrous for the incumbents that ultimately are held responsible for it. And in this case, I think that it'll likely fall on the shoulders of the president, but it remains to be seen whether or not these programs work.
Well, and so one of the things that has already been mentioned, and I know is to your point, Chris, about the politicization of this, the media has played obviously an instrumental role in obviously the public health crisis that we're in terms of getting information out to people, not just in Oregon, but around the country. But also too, there have been a lot of questions and there has been a lot of debate around how the media whether it's, local news here in the, Portland metro region or Bend region, as well as the national media, is how they are covering it, actually helping. And one of the data points that I thought was interesting in DHM's survey was this point about whether or not people feel as though media coverage of the pandemic has been exaggerated, if the media is getting it right, if it's being underestimated. So I'm curious. So John Horvick, let's start with you. I'm just curious from a researcher's perspective, what does this tell you about how Oregonians are feeling about the information that they're getting about the crisis we're in now?
Well, if you frame it as Oregonians tend to think that, as a plurality, we're doing okay. So I look at these numbers as saying, most folks think they're getting it right. But if you look underneath the data, now this survey was a couple weeks ago, so things have shifted as new information comes out, is that there's a fairly significant divide between Democrats and Republicans, where Democrats are more likely to say that we're being underestimated, and Republicans more likely to say it's being exaggerated. And it's those sorts of differences, like, I think there's some hopeful things in these data, like how people respond to public health agencies, but some worrisome things as well, is that people's perception of the crisis, and then therefore the perception of who to follow and what actions to take, are divided by partisanship and sort of news sources. And it's that D versus R difference with this question that gives me a little bit of concern. So overall, Oregonians, I think, are okay, but separated out by party, there's a difference.
John Isaacs, I want to go back to something that you mentioned, which is that, the election will be about one person and one person only. And from a media perspective, you certainly see that at the national level. If you're, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, do you think that trickles down to local news? I mean, is there a way for the media to somehow, at the local level, play a different role in terms of how it's communicating and reporting about the crisis?
Yeah, I think, first, can I just take a minute and just give a plug for our local media? This crisis is impacting businesses large and small. And I mean, at PBA, we've heard the stories every day, and they really are as bad as people are hearing. And our media has obviously not been left out of that. And they're all struggling. We've seen they're doing layoffs, and their coverage during this crisis, this is my personal opinion, has been absolutely fantastic. And I just encourage people to sign up for subscriptions to all our local media, help them survive, because we really need them. I think that, going back to my original point, just about how much this is about our current president, the national media seems to be being consumed completely through that lens. And so, we have just a complete divide where literally in any given day of news coverage, Americans can get almost two different types of coverage of the same event. If you were to watch a Fox News versus a CNN or an MSNBC, I encourage people to do that regularly so you would experience it yourself. People like me who like to live in the sort of nonpartisan moderate area, I do that regularly so I can see how people are consuming things differently. I think that's given a real role for our local media to really be focused on transparency, really get the right information out to the community, and that's why they're getting the ratings that they deserve. That's been about right. And they've done a really good job. So, I think, like, given, again, the polarization of our national politics makes us more dependent on having really good, solid local coverage, which we've been lucky enough to have here in Oregon, where they've really played a role, especially in getting, transparent data out on a regular basis from the state. That's turned into, I think, a real partnership, but at first it really took some pushing from our local reporters to make that happen, and that's been to the benefit of all of us.
Yeah. Chris, let me ask you a question on just how is it changing how organizations and companies, brands, trade associations here in Oregon, for instance, how is it changing how we're communicating and how just the art of communications is being influenced by this, given the fact that there's questions at the national level about news coverage, but to John's point, it's a little bit different here in Oregon.
Sure. I would say that we're having to have a lot more conversations, with clients who are looking to achieve communication goals. We're talking to them more about what their audience is looking for. And we have to have some realistic conversations, about who are we trying to talk to, whether it's employees or customers, political stakeholders, or the broader public. and reminding folks, like what we're seeing here in John Horvick's data, we have to be cognizant of what people are concerned with right now. You don't want to be tone deaf and try to push, an initiative or a message out there that's not in alignment with what your audience is experiencing at the moment. So, that means taking some extra time, to step back and think about, one, what are we trying to achieve with communication? Yeah. Two, do we need to get this out right now? And if so, how do we repackage, our message into the moment, into what people are actually experiencing, so that it resonates. Obviously, if you want to talk about an issue in the public sphere, whether that's housing or homelessness or the environment or manufacturing, trade associations are still wanting to get those messages out, but they have to reframe them. So the way that they talked about those issues in January or February don't necessarily align with what our current situation is. So you have to make your message resonate, in the midst of this national pandemic, and find a way to nest it within the conversation that everybody else is having about COVID-19.
Right. John Isaacs.
Zach, real quick, I did want to just kind of jump back and reinforce something that John Isaacs was saying around the bifurcation of news coverage. I mean, this is something that I remember, 15 years ago, writing a college paper, on the diversification of media outlets and how it was fueling polarization in this country. And, a lot of this is pretty natural. Since we removed the fairness doctrine, or the FCC removed the fairness doctrine that mandated equal time, for broadcast news stations, we've seen sort of the two universes start to, decouple, where we've got Americans who are living on the right and Americans who are living on the left. And the news that they consume reinforces that divide. It's unfortunate. I'd sort of hoped with as much optimism for, American unity as possible, that, this type of crisis would be something that would ultimately start to unite those two Americas. But, unfortunately, the data that we're seeing, to John Horvick's point, is actually showing that while there was some uniting really early on, it's starting to spread as the issue becomes politicized. And so that means that, just wanted to throw this idea out there. It means that the way that coronavirus changes campaigns will be different in rural communities than it will be in urban communities. So, I don't think that there's any sort of like broad brush that we can paint the entire political climate with and say, this is going to be the way that it is across the board. You're gonna see differences, and it'll be really based on whether or not you're in a Republican base area or you're in a Democratic base area.
So the hardest part of moderating is keeping things moving. I want to be respectful of all of our participants' time here, but I do want to make sure we get a chance for everyone to answer this question. And John Horvick, because this is the business you're in, I'll start with you. What are the things, beyond the questions perhaps that you asked in your initial survey, what are the trends that you're continuing to watch, and why do you think those specific trends are the ones that will be most important to watch going into this fall? Did we lose Mr. Horvick? I see a frozen screen.
John is on mute there.
Yeah, I think we may have lost him. So John Isaacs, I'm going to toss that to you then. So the trends that you feel like are really important to be keeping an eye on, like what are the things that you guys are watching at the Business Alliance, and why do you ultimately think that those are the trends that really are going to end up shaping what happens going into 2021?
You're still on mute, John.
He's looking for it. I can see.
There we go.
There he
It
is.
takes a few pushes of the button here in this. So I'm going to go back and I missed one point on media I wanted to make because I looked at this before this call. This is an interesting tidbit. So because we are all, most of the country's under stay-at-home orders, TV viewership's way up, okay? 38% TV ratings are up. Local news ratings are up 30%. So there's just more consumption of TV news going on right now. And then that's going to have an impact on campaigns. So, I'm still a sort of nerd out on how campaigns tactically allocate their resources in terms of whether they're focused on digital or TV. And, there's been this argument about whether TV advertising was sort of, running out of steam as the dominant medium for campaigns and it was moving to digital. I think you're going to see this election, anyone who has the resources to spend money on TV, especially ad buys connected to nightly news, have a huge advantage over candidates that don't have those kinds of resources. Just wanted to point that out on media. Yeah. Now, in terms of trends, here's what we're going to be watching. So first of all, can Congress get its act together? There was a rare bipartisan 96-0 vote in the Senate, nearly unanimous in the House to pass the CARES Act. We now know that was nearly not enough, especially small businesses. That act was passed 3 weeks ago. It's already out of money. The Paycheck Protection Program. The first thing is, can Congress get it together and come back together in a bipartisan way and pass a second round of economic stimulus that is worthy of the crisis that we're in? That's the first thing we're going to look for. If that can't happen, then all bets are off in terms of how bad this economic fallout's going to be. And as Chris pointed out, right now voters are optimistic, 6 to 8 months out, but if that could start to erode pretty quickly, and if you start to see in polls that number start to erode, then you're really going to see some volatility in terms of how this is impacting elections. The second is simply, do we continue to see a bending of the curve and see the public health measures work? We're really seeing that on the West Coast, right, where we had some of the earliest, strongest responses from our governors. I really think that's, we're lucky to be here on the West Coast where we saw coordinated, swift action from our leaders. The question will be, do we see that across the country or not? Or do the models we see come out towards the more sort of dire end, or do they come out towards the lower end? So, just those two simple things are the trends. In terms of voters, I think we have to keep looking to independents, right? Where do independents rate the president? And, the lens I'm going to keep looking at elections is, how do they rate the president? Because I think that's going to carry all the way down the ballot. And right now, independents give the president a 39% approval rating. Does that go up or down? Where's the energy, right? Which voters on which side are more likely to turn out this fall? Polls pretty consistently show a pretty sizable advantage for energy on the Democratic side, but we could see that even out, right? As we've seen sort of some conservative activism now around the stay-at-home orders. Like, does that drive energy up on the other side? Those are the kinds of things, we'll be looking at. But the two biggest have to be just, does Congress come together to get another round of stimulus passed that's meaningful? And do we start to see the public health measures really work nationally?
So John Horvick is back with us. And John Horvick, I want to give you the final word because you are the guy who is out there watching these trends and monitoring things. What are the trends you are continuing to watch at DHM, and why do you think those are the important ones to keep an eye on?
Two big ones. First, I mentioned it before, age is a huge divider, not just party, huge divider in how people are experiencing this. And that plays out in different ways. It's going to play out in policy that gets advanced. It's also going to play out in elections. Young people are getting hammered and feel it more on the economic side, at least as of today. They're also much less likely to vote. And it's just a reality, especially in primaries. And so when we think about those funding measures and who's most likely to cast a ballot, how the economy is affecting older people is going to be relatively more important, at least in May, probably, than how it's affecting younger people. The other big thing, and this is a plug for our next poll, I suppose, is we're really watching what Oregonians want and expect in terms of how to relax stay-at-home orders, return to normal. I suspect as we move into that dialogue, we're going to see sharper differences around expectations and tougher ratings of politicians going forward and the actions that they take.
Yeah. Well, let's move into questions. I think there's an opportunity here for folks that are with us to sort of pose some additional questions that perhaps weren't asked to our panelists. And I'm going to do my best here to pull in some questions. If you've got your chat function open, I should be able to see stuff if you send it through to Hubble Communications, and we'll start refereeing some incoming questions here. The floor is officially open.
Well, while we're waiting for those questions, John Horvick, one question that I would love to see inserted into DHM's polling, as somebody who just genuinely feels that this is going to get worse before it gets better from an economic standpoint, is I'd love to see a tracker on who voters blame for this situation. That's going to be really the trend line that I'm going to be looking for.
Right. It's a good point and a good prompt for me. I think John and Chris, you both agree with this. You know, people tend to vote as much or more by who they're mad at than who they like, and so who they're given responsibility to and the backlash to that, I think, is going to be a key variable.
Yeah. So here's a question that just came in. So the question is, and Chris, I'll direct this to you. What would a COVID-19 special session in Oregon look like?
Well, there's actually a handbook. Anybody can go to the legislature's website, and they've published a little handy 2 or 3 page handbook that explains the difference between a regular session and a special session. They're going to ultimately have to come back to have a special session to allocate funds. The best thing that I could say, I mean, in all honesty, is probably underwhelming, is what we would expect to see out of a legislative session. And it's simply because the state, at least at this point in its emergency board funds, has pretty limited resources that are available. You know, we've talked a little bit about the economy, and from the state's perspective, that economic cliff is really going to start to crystallize after the May revenue forecast. And, you know, and I think that once you start to see, you know, all sorts of holes within the state's own budget and their inability to sort of continue funding current service levels, that's where you're going to see the debate start to shift away from, okay, how do we actually do something big to help Oregonians right now in this crisis, to how do we stop this ship from sinking? But, you know, look, I would just, you know, say for anybody who's looking at the upcoming, a hypothetical upcoming special session,
Right.
to just be prepared that it's likely that whatever funding package the legislature would be approving is already going to be negotiated well in advance. So we're not going to likely see a whole bunch of drama within that session, although I've been surprised in the last couple of years. But probably some sort of modest package that will provide political cover to both parties, that they are focused and on this issue, and, you know, some take-home messaging for constituents. But I'm not expecting anything that's going to be nearly as impactful as what's coming out of the federal level.
Right. A question for John Horvick, and it has to do with the right track, wrong track question asked in so many of your polls.
Yeah.
Question is, how do you explain the inverse trend with right track, wrong track right now, given the fact that everything doesn't seem to be on the right track?
Right. It's a great question. So just a real quick setup, just for context. DHM did statewide surveys in December 2019, both Oregon and Washington State, asking right direction, wrong track. And from the December survey to the March survey that we did in COVID, in Oregon, the right direction number fell 5 points. In Washington, it increased 15 points. So when I saw the Oregon number originally, I was actually quite shocked that it didn't drop much more. It's been as low as in the mid-20s after September 11th. So we held basically steady, and in Washington we saw a bump. I think that what people are responding to that question right now is specific to COVID. Like, do they think that their state leaders are taking the right actions? Do they see bending of the curve happening? That the narrowness of how people are answering that question is something unique to this moment. And I expect as time goes on, they'll be considering other factors. But right now in Oregon, we basically held steady, and in Washington, we've seen a pretty significant jump upwards. And I think it's a vote of confidence primarily in the leadership and public health officials and governors and local electeds.
Yeah. John Isaacs, do you want to add to that? As soon as you find a mute button. Getting faster. Getting faster.
So I would just add that we saw this. So I was able to get participate in a briefing on some regional polling recently, and the same dynamics playing out regionally. DHM has been PBA's pollster for decades, and we do a survey with them every year that has shown the same thing regionally, that the right track, wrong track has been upside down for some time, really connected to livability issues. And in fact, it was the worst in Multnomah County. And, you've seen, wrong track, voters saying we're on the wrong track, even in the midst of the longest economic expansion on record, which has now completely been reversed. But interestingly, in the regional polling I was able to get a briefing on a couple of days ago, the same things happened. It's now over 50% right track, wrong track's below 40. And that's completely related to a vote of confidence in the local regional response to the current crisis as well. So, again, that bodes well for any, a complete flip in what I would have told you a month ago bodes well for any incumbent running for re-election. Whereas a month ago, I would have said we're in another change election. So,
yeah. This is a question for Chris. How it kind of pivots a little bit off of, I think, John Isaacs, what you were just talking about. How should candidates be talking about the recovery of Oregon and specific industries and specific business sectors that are unique to Oregon versus, a state like Texas or Georgia? How should candidates be talking about recovery as we get further into this?
Well, if I was advising a candidate, it would be talking about recovery in a way that aligns with their specific electorate. I think that each candidate is going to have to look at who are the voters in their district, who are the voters that are going to be with them, who are the persuadable folks, and then craft a message that's based off of the values of those folks. That conversation about recovery is going to look different in Gresham than it will in Lake Oswego or Salem or Pendleton, for example, right? And to the extent that candidates are able to come up with really well-crafted, well-developed policy solutions and messaging platforms that focus specifically on the circumstances for their constituents, I think that they're going to see they're going to see benefit out of that. So if you've got a lot of manufacturing facilities in your district, obviously you're going to be talking about the recovery of the manufacturing sector. Predominantly agricultural communities and timber communities are going to be talking about those issues. It's really no different, the mix than it is in any other cycle, except that today versus 2018, candidates are going to have to be far more in tune with the actual economic situation at the kitchen table for those people who are going to be voting. This is going to look a lot more like 2010 in terms of the messaging around jobs and growth than it has in years past.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and call it for us here today, folks, because I want to make sure that we're not losing folks that maybe have other obligations over the lunch hour. I just do want to say, thank you to everybody that joined in. We had, roughly 50 so folks join us today for this conversation. Very much thanks to John, and Chris for their time in sort of sharing insights into things that they're seeing. I do want to do just a very quick plug to let folks know that we'll be doing our next webinar on May 1st. It will focus on the impact of this crisis on higher education institutions, specifically in Oregon, but obviously we'll have conversations about how it's impacting higher ed generally. Just keep an eye out for the invite for that. And thank you guys all for joining us. Thank you for the panelists. And everybody have a great Friday and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Guys.